Right now, a narrow strip of water most people have never even thought about is quietly shaping how expensive your life is about to become. Because the Strait of Hormuz, a passage only about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, carries roughly 20 million barrels of oil every single day, along with a massive portion of the world's liquefied natural gas, which means nearly one-fifth of global oil consumption depends on this one fragile route staying open, stable, and predictable. And this is where the situation becomes uncomfortable, because that stability is starting to crack, and the consequences are already being felt across the global economy, not in theory, but in real time. As tensions in the region have intensified, shipping risks have increased, and physical oil markets have reacted sharply. In some cases, pushing prices close to $150 per barrel, while insurance costs for tankers moving through the region have surged dramatically, sometimes increasing by several hundred%. And when you hear numbers like that, it sounds like a problem for governments or corporations. But the reality is much closer to you than it seems. Because oil is not just fuel for cars, it is the backbone of transportation, logistics, manufacturing, agriculture, and even electricity in many parts of the world. So when disruptions occur at a choke point like Hormuz, the effect does not stay contained. It spreads outward through a chain reaction that most people never see but always feel, and this is where it gets more interesting. Because markets do not wait for a full crisis to react. They move based on expectations, meaning even the risk of disruption can push prices higher, which is exactly what we are seeing now as countries begin adjusting their import strategies, securing alternative supply routes, and competing for limited energy resources, especially in Asia, where more than 80% of oil and gas flowing through Hormuz is directed, with countries like India and China already increasing imports from alternative sources to reduce dependency on the region. And this behavior itself creates pressure because when multiple large economies start competing for replacement supply at the same time, prices naturally rise. And this is where the psychological side of the system reveals itself, because most people experience this not as a clear cause and effect, but as confusion. They notice fuel prices rising, shipping delays increasing, groceries becoming more expensive, and they assume it is just another wave of inflation without understanding that it is being driven by a very specific and very real bottleneck thousands of miles away. And this disconnect matters because it shows how modern economies hide their vulnerabilities behind layers of complexity, making it difficult for people to connect global events to personal impact. But once you understand the chain, everything starts to make sense. Because the process is actually very simple. When supply through Hormuz becomes uncertain, oil prices rise. When oil prices rise, transportation costs increase. When transportation costs increase, businesses adjust prices to protect margins. And when businesses adjust prices, inflation spreads across the economy. And this is where things become even more serious. Because inflation is not just about prices going up, it forces central banks into difficult decisions, often leading to higher interest rates, tighter financial conditions, and slower economic growth, which means a geopolitical disruption can quickly evolve into a broader economic slowdown. And institutions like the IMF have already begun warning about this exact scenario, highlighting the risk of slower global growth combined with rising inflation, a combination that is particularly difficult to manage. And this is what makes the Strait of Hormuz crisis different from many other geopolitical events, because it sits at the intersection of energy, trade, and macroeconomics, meaning its impact is not limited to one sector. It affects everything at once. And there is another layer that most people overlook, which is the role of shipping and logistics. Because even if oil is still technically flowing, the cost of moving it can increase significantly due to higher insurance premiums, rerouted shipments, and longer transit times. And these hidden costs are often passed along quietly, embedded into the prices of goods and services without drawing attention to their origin, which is why people rarely associate higher prices with events like this, even though they are directly connected. And this leads to a deeper insight about how the global system actually works, because it is not just about supply and demand, it is about reliability. And when reliability breaks down, even slightly, the entire system becomes more expensive to operate. And this is something markets understand very clearly, which is why even small disruptions can lead to disproportionately large reactions. And historically, this pattern has repeated itself multiple times, from tanker attacks in 2019 to previous periods of tension in the region where even the threat of disruption was enough to move global oil prices and increase shipping risks. And this is important because it shows that the system is highly sensitive to uncertainty, not just actual damage. And right now, uncertainty is exactly what we have, with increasing geopolitical tensions, strategic positioning by major powers, and ongoing debates around control and access to the strait, all contributing to a situation where stability can no longer be taken for granted. And this brings us to the bigger picture, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just a geographic location, it is a reminder of how interconnected and fragile the global economy really is, how something that appears distant and unrelated can have direct consequences on everyday life, and how quickly conditions can change when a critical system is disrupted. And there is also a behavioral pattern at play here, because during stable periods, countries and companies tend to optimize for efficiency, relying on predictable routes and just-in-time supply chains. But when uncertainty rises, they shift toward resilience, building a past capacity, diversifying suppliers, and increasing inventories, all of which are more expensive. And this transition from efficiency to resilience is one of the hidden drivers of rising costs during crises, because stability allows for optimization, but instability forces redundancy, and redundancy always comes at a price. And this is why events like the Hormuz crisis feel like sudden shocks, even though they are often the result of long-building pressures that were simply not visible to most people. And this leads to a final point that is worth thinking about, which is that the modern economy, despite its size and complexity, still depends heavily on a small number of critical choke points. And when one of them becomes unstable, it reveals just how much of our daily lives are built on systems we rarely notice, and how quickly those systems can influence everything from inflation to growth to financial stability. So the next time you notice prices rising or the economy feeling uncertain, it is worth asking not just what is happening locally, but what might be happening globally behind the scenes. Because sometimes the real cause is not in your country, not in your job, and not even in your control, but in a narrow waterway that the world depends on far more than it realizes. And that is what makes the Strait of Hormuz crisis so important, because it is not just a regional issue, it is a global signal, and understanding it changes how you see the entire system. Subscribe if you want to understand the hidden forces shaping your money and your future.